All right, here we go. So yes, today's question is, does God test us? It's a good question, a challenging question. I'm excited about this one. Although I wasn't excited about last week's, and that one turned out to be really good. So you never know what you're going to get with these questions.
Last week's was really confusing. I'm still not sure what separates some groups from being cults,
Not much. Sometimes it might waffle back and forth.
And I guess it can have a positive as well as a negative meaning too.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I'm thinking it, I'm thinking all negative, but it could be a positive thing too. I don't know.
Sometimes depends on what you're referring to, but yes.
Well,
let's talk about something else that's really confusing and hard to figure out.
Okay.
So, does God test us? When I start thinking about this question, I have some assumptions that I bring into the mix, and most of them have to do with parenting, with the psychology of parenting. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about the metaphor of the parent. And, speaking about God with this metaphor, attempting to understand God kind of as a parent or as a figure in our lives that shares some similarities with parents. So when we're talking about testing, I think we have several different possible avenues that we want to investigate. We're a big thing these days is to talk about the teachable moment. That when children or people that we're responsible for come upon a problem or come upon a pitfall of some kind, we want to allow them to work through that so that they can learn something from it, so that they can grow in relationship to that particular area of being, whatever it happens to be. So when we're talking about, God testing us, God creating scenarios that will, make us work, make us hopefully grow, that is, not unheard of in terms of, educational pedagogy. The idea that, we're developing confidence and independence with our students or our children, allowing mistakes to take place in a safe environment. Obviously, a good parent would perhaps allow their child to, walk on the curb on the edge of the parking lot if there aren't any cars around. And if they fall off the curb because they're not quite there yet, then that's you can kind of consider that a teachable moment. They might skin their knee or something, but you wouldn't allow your child to walk on a curb next to a highway. If they fell into the street there, then, they'd be dead. So you don't want that. So kind of judging the spaces where it's appropriate to allow moments to be teachable is, I think, an important part of the parent position. And also establishing rules and then allowing students to experience the natural consequences of their choices, I think is kind of part of that teachable moment thing. But I think it's patience and consistency are really important when you are working within this frame. You have to provide opportunities for the child to just determine or discover who they are. And often the kinds of questions that kids are wrestling with can only be answered in the moment. That you could sit a child down and you could say, so what kind of person are you going to be? Or what are your priorities in life? And you can have a discussion about that. But sometimes we can't really figure out who we are until we come up upon a test, a situation, a trial. in the moment, what kind of person am I? Am I the kind of person who is going to rush into traffic to save the child who's wandered into the middle of the street, or am I the kind of person who's going to hold back? What are my priorities? And a lot of times we can't know that until we get into those situations. So, it's not always a negative thing, I think, to come upon tests and trials in our lives. And then the role of the parent in those kinds of situations, or the role of the caregiver, is, to provide backup, to be supportive, to provide some advice maybe, but not to control or command. To tell the person that they have no free will in the situation doesn't help them to grow. To always be controlling your child's behavior and decision making just holds them back from becoming their own people and developing independence. But you also, I think, have to watch out for what I would call like a gotcha moment. When a parent or someone who's supposed to be supporting a child or a student or someone that's growing, a mentor, when they create a circumstance knowing that you will very likely fail, isn't that a betrayal of the trust that child or student has put in the mentor or the parent? If my job as a parent is to back up the child, to support the child, to have the child's best interests at heart, then the child has to be able to trust that that's always going to be the case, so that I will not put the child into a situation where they could easily get into trouble. I think that gotcha moments where the intent is to grab, get the child or get the person to make the bad choice or to do the thing that is wrong. Trying to trap the child is certainly not an appropriate way to engage in the parent-child relationship. I think that there needs to be evidence of love and trustworthiness in the way that these circumstances are provided, these opportunities are provided to the child. And there's even biblical evidence for some of these kinds of parenting concepts. Oh, that's nice. This is from Ephesians chapter 6, verse money sign. I don't know. 4 probably, since that's where the money sign is. But it's, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So some of the translations of these words about provoking and anger can indicate kind of that relationship idea, that we're not supposed to, parents are not supposed to provoke their children. They're not supposed to intentionally make their children feel and experience negative emotions and that kind of thing, but are supposed to guide them, are supposed to support them, are supposed to, yes, allow circumstances to test them, but also make sure that that's happening within a safe environment, so that the core of who the child is protected. So I think that's something that I think is really important as we enter into this question about, does God test us? So any questions or comments on the metaphor of the parent? Nope. All right. So then kind of on the flip side, we have the metaphor of the child, that if God is the parent, then we are God's children. And we think about from this perspective, I think about the quote, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test," that Jesus said when he was in the wilderness being tempted by Satan, or whatever figure that particular version was talking about. The idea that if the child is being put to the test by the parent, that's, should be the intention. There should be to help the child to grow and to develop. But do children put their parents to the test? Do they attempt to, figure out kind of where their parents stand? Yes, they do. Children are constantly pushing the boundaries, testing the limits. If I do this, will you still love me? If I do this, will you still support me and care about me? Are you really going to enforce these rules that you have set down? Why are these rules in place? I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to navigate in this world. I'm trying to grow my independence while also understanding how relationships work, how I'm going to relate to you, how I'm going to relate to others. And so, I think that's part of the process of growing, part of the development of a child, and the role of the parent, again, is to provide spaces for these things to happen safely, but also to provide the limits that are necessary, so that the child learns that it's not okay to hit me when you're angry, not just because I don't want to be hit, but because if you learn not to hit me, then you won't be hitting your peers, you won't be hitting your teachers, you won't be hitting other people who are less safe, less reliable relationships, less trustworthy, less loyal than I am. So I think these kinds of dynamics are important for us to think about as we think about this question of God, does God test us? If God is like a parent, if we use this metaphor, then in what ways could God be using some of these tactics with us as we attempt to grow in our faith and our and grow into who God created us to be? And if we are God's children, then what is our role in testing the limits and pushing the boundaries and kind of trying to grow ourselves by understanding more and more of what the world is like and who God is in relationship to us? So those are some of the preliminary assumptions that I bring to this question. Any other thoughts that you want to throw in before we start hopping into some of the content? Karen, I think you're muted.
Yeah. I can see the value of these two issues, in explaining this, does God test us? Because it's going to be from both sides. And so I appreciate this introduction. I can see where you're going with it.
Yeah, so hopefully we can kind of keep some of this in the back of our minds as we take a look at some Bible passages. But before we do that, I want to talk about some vocabulary, sort of, and consider possibly some of the differences with some of these terminologies. So they're all T words in English, interestingly enough. But as I was working on this and looking at the different Bible passages that we might engage with, I saw a variety of different words being used. And the main ones were test, temptation, and trial. So I started thinking a little bit about, how are these words related, but then how are they different? And so I think, I'd like to kind of establish, what we mean by these words as we're talking today, so that we can kind of use the same language. And you can disagree with me, and I'd love to hear your reasons and your ideas on how I'm defining these words. And then we can just kind of decide together, that this is how we're going to use these words, or try to use these words today, so that we can be specific and clear about what it is we're talking about. So I think that when it comes to these words, it's about intention. Intentionality matters. So a test, the intention of a test is to check to see what you know or can do. You are, the person who's in charge sets an expected standard to which you're expected to achieve. And then value is placed on you based on how you measure up to that standard. And this is, of course, what you get at school with school testing. Are you at level? Are you above level? Are you below level? What do we need to do to make sure that you get you to at least at level, if not above level? So there's a standard that you're being compared to. So that's, to me, is kind of what a test is. A temptation is different. A temptation places before you something that is known to give you pause, something that is known to make you want to step off your chosen path. And then the intention there is to test your resolve. How long can you endure? How much can you endure before you give in? And so it's not comparing you to a standard. It's intentionally trying to kind of knock you off the path that you are on. And then with trials, the word try, I would like to, I think it's most helpful to look at this not like court and jury trials, but like Olympic trials. So when you make it into the Olympic trials, it's because you have reached a certain point in your athletic ability. And it's an opportunity to show the judges who you are, show them what you can do, show them the best of what it means to be you. And so there are kind of some standards that you're supposed to be meeting, but for the most part, what's actually happening is you're competing against yourself, and you're competing in some ways against your peers, so that you can, be ranked among the peers. But it's not, it's not that they say, okay, so as long as you can, do a split, you get into the gymnastics, and everybody who can do a split gets into the gymnastics. It all depends on who you're competing against, who you're trying yourself against. So there's not really a set standard so much as where do you rank in relationship to these others. And I don't want to focus so much on the comparison to others so much as on show us what you can do, show us who you are, show us the best of what it means to be you, so that you can be placed where you'll succeed. If you are put in the Olympic trials in like gymnastics or some of the track and field events, you might have a variety of events that you participate in, but they want to see, where are you going to do best? Are we going to put you into the all around competition where you have to do all of the different gymnastics elements, or are you really, really good at the balance beam and not so good at the floor routine? And maybe we don't put you in for the floor routine because we want to know where you will succeed. We want to know what you are best at. So maybe in a way, like almost like auditions for a school play. You're not going to get kicked out of the play, but we're trying to figure out where you will succeed, where you will shine best, things like that. So questions, comments, kind of modifications to this suggested use of the terminologies.
Looks good.
All right. Easy group today. All right, so now what I want to do is get into some looking at some Bible passages and thinking about how these Bible passages help us to address this question. And we're going to keep biblical hermeneutics in mind. I've used this word a lot in a variety of our classes, but biblical hermeneutics is about thinking about how you read the Bible, thinking about how you interpret the Bible. What are the assumptions that you make when you are reading the Bible? How do you understand what the purpose of the Bible is? Questions like that are wrapped up in biblical hermeneutics. So thinking about questions like, what is the purpose of this collection of stories? What assumptions guide our reading? How do we interpret what the text says to us? What standard, what guidelines are we going to use to try to understand this? So as we're looking at some of these passages, we're going to kind of take a look at some of the principles of biblical hermeneutics that I think are important for us to keep in mind when we're trying to come to a reasonable conclusion about this question. Does God test us? So the first passage that I want us to think about, we're not actually going to read the passage itself unless y'all really, really want to. I do have a few verses here that I put into my notes just in case we want to look at the real text itself. But I want to think about Genesis chapter 3, which Christians typically call the story of the fall of humankind. And I want to, instead of focusing on the passage itself, I want to think about some of the other places in the Bible that refer to this story, that interpret this story, because one of the primary biblical hermeneutical truths that at least Lutherans hold to for sure is that the Bible interprets the Bible, that we have to use other parts of the Bible to help us understand what's happening in other places. So I didn't put it in the text, but I can read really quickly just the basics of the story of Genesis chapter 3. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the tree in the garden, but God said you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, for you shall die." But the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. So this is the basic story of Genesis chapter 3. But when we look at this story, we bring a lot more to it than the basics of the passage say to us. And that this is true of a lot of the famous passages, the famous stories in the Bible. We assume that we know what it's about. But the reason why we assume that we know what it's about is because of the interpretational assumptions that we bring, that we learn. And in this case, there are a lot of different passages within the Bible itself, in other books, that help us along toward making these conclusions about what this story means. So when I read it, all it said was at the beginning, the serpent was more crafty than any other animal that the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, did God really say this? And the woman said, no. The woman said, yeah, that's what God said. And so it doesn't really say that the serpent was trying to tempt her, the serpent was trying to trick her. It just says the serpent was crafty. And then he said this. And so we gather that, we make a conclusion from the information that we're given. So I want to look at two Bible verses here that speak about Genesis chapter 3. Romans 7 verse 5 says, "While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death." And then 2 Corinthians 11:3 says, "But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ." And so these kinds of passages in the Bible guide us in the way that we're supposed to read this. But I think this is really interesting because, especially looking at the 2 Corinthians verse, as the serpent deceived Eve, the serpent did not deceive Eve. When we look at this story, the serpent asks a question and she answers it. And then the serpent says, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And guess what? They didn't die. Eve had said that even if they touch the tree, let alone eat from it, they'll die, but they don't. So what is the deception? There is none. He's telling the truth. But we interpret it that way because the Bible interprets the Bible. 2 Corinthians 11:3 is telling us that the author of that book is interpreting the story this way. But this is not the only interpretation for Genesis chapter 3. If we look at the way, especially that Jewish scholars have interpreted this passage for generations, they're not so much interested in the sin part, in the introduction of death. They're more interested in what this story tells us about some answers to important questions. They see this passage more like a trial, like a test of the first humans. What kind of creation are you going to be? Will you remain puppets? Will you just follow along with everything that God says and never make any decisions for yourself? Or are you going to grab hold of the free will that God has given to you? The idea that God instills values into the people, the value of obedience to God, the value of trusting in what God is saying to you. But then the people are left to make their own choices. They have received these values, they've received the law, but then they're allowed to make their own choices. And so the moral development of humans, both as individuals and as groups, means that they're going to make mistakes and that there will be consequences for those mistakes. In this passage, I didn't read the whole thing to you, but in this passage, there are words like naked and ashamed and crafty. And all of these words come from the same Hebrew root. So shrewd and ashamed and naked all mean the same, all are all the same word. So if you understand that, then it's possible to read this story as a story in which humans become self-aware for the first time. They become aware of their own ethical existence. And because they are now aware of themselves, they are aware that they are different from God, they are different from other creatures. Now they have a responsibility to make ethical choices. Ethical indifference is no longer possible now that they are aware of themselves and their free will and their, even their existence as an entity outside of God, outside of other creations. If you are different from something else, then everything you do has an ethical pro or con to it because it affects that other that is not yourself. And so this is a really interesting possible interpretation of this passage, given the question that we're asking today. If the very first trial, when we use that kind of Olympic trial or audition for the school play kind of trial, this is the first trial of the humans. And it's asking questions. It's not tempting them. It's not trying intentionally to guide them off the path. It's not God setting them up for failure. It's God saying, I am establishing for you the moral bounds. But now you have to figure out who you're going to be. You're brand new. Who are you? What are you going to do with the free will that I've given you? Are you going to reject it so that you can remain in this, this simple life of just following along with what I do? Or are you going to grab hold of it? Are you going to make your own choices? Are you going to be bold in making mistakes? Are you going to join me in creating the world that you're going to live in by making your choices, by making your ethical decisions, and then addressing and dealing with the consequences, whether those consequences are good or bad? And the choice that's made is that, yes, we are going to grab hold of our free will. Yes, we are going to step out. Yes, we are going to take those values that you've instilled in us, but we're also going to make our own choices and decide for ourselves what's right. And then because of that, we are going to have the capacity for developing. Because you can't get better without making a mistake and dealing with the consequences of it.
But all that happened because of the serpent. If they would have just gone along day to day, not eating, who knows what would have happened. Although the serpent was certainly under God's control that happened. I mean, that's kind of what I believe. But if that hadn't have, if the serpent didn't, well, here they say deceive, lead her to doing that, then they wouldn't have had free will.
Well,
they would have been controlled by God.
Maybe not. I don't think we can speculate about what would have happened if the serpent hadn't said anything. Do you think eventually they would have gotten curious themselves and gone over there, or
certainly true,
that kind of thing?
But I wonder what God had in mind of telling them not to do that they were just to follow him.
Yeah. So, and I think that this interpretation is more satisfying to me, because if you go with the standard of, deception and sinful passions that were aroused by the law. So look at Romans 7:5. Our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. So just by creating the rule, God is being unfair, I think. Mm-hmm. Because it's like with children. Let's go back to our metaphor. If my kid is not, sticking a fork in the light socket and has never thought to do that, am I going to say to my kid, now, Johnny, don't stick a fork in the light socket, because now guess what? I just gave the kid that idea.
Right.
So you kind of have to balance, what is this child capable of? What is this child interested in doing? And then we have to add on another layer, that we didn't create the world that we live in, but God did. God could have very well just not put that tree in the garden. And so that didn't have to have that rule. Right. So Romans 7 tells us that our sinful passions are aroused by the law. God giving them that command not to eat of that tree, if we think about it from that perspective, as it's about sin, it's about being deceived, it's about being led astray. If that's the way we interpret it, then God created a world in which the source of our death existed. Then God pointed it out to us and told us not to touch it, but didn't tell us why, really.
Right.
And then possibly, if your interpretation is correct, used this serpent to deceive or cajole or encourage or lead them toward doing that thing.
Right.
That is a terrible parent. That is a terrible God. I don't want to follow that God. I don't want to worship that God. And so how else can we understand this? What is the alternative way to understand this that doesn't lead us down this track of God being this awful, awful despot who's just trying to, intentionally lead us into sin? Well, if this is not about sin and us falling away from God, if it's about us establishing who we are, God giving us a choice
and learning,
then it's not about temptation. It's about the trial. It's about, who are you going to be? You have to make a decision in this moment. And that decision isn't just, morally ambiguous or morally indifferent. This decision is going to impact your future. It's going to tell me who you are, who you want to be in relationship to me. I am giving you the choice, not just to eat from this tree. I'm giving you the choice for whether or not you want to be in relationship with me, or whether you want to be me. You want to just continue to, be an extension of me as God. And the creation says, no, I don't want to be you. I want to be other than you. I want to establish an ethical relationship with you and with everything else that you've created that is not me. And I think that is the way that, I'm going to best grow and develop and find meaning and beauty in this world and in my relationships. And I think I like that. I think that's nice. I think that's beautiful that God, God didn't just say, okay, so here you are not me, go and do some stuff. God said, hey, I've created you, and now you get to decide what kind of creation you want to be. And
He
that's
kind of led them like we lead our children sometimes into learning and doing and acting.
yeah, but they still
So
had the choice of what they wanted to do.
right.
So if
And
that,
so did our children.
so if we use that interpretation rather than the interpretations that the Bible gives us, then that can kind of lead us into, understanding a little bit about what God's testing or what I prefer, trials look like and why they are there. So any other comments on this one? Move on to the next one.
Well, if you look at it from a parent's point of view, you can't make a child do anything they don't want to do. I mean, that thought has to be in their head first, because just telling them don't do this is never going to stop them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people do what they want to do. They say, well, I don't like this or I don't like that, but they do it anyway. But I think something in them makes them want to do that. I don't know. I'm just thinking about people who are just destined to break the law. They don't like having a law. They don't like this mask thing that we're going through right now. There's a bunch of people that just didn't like it that somebody said you got to wear a mask. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And yet just telling them they got to do this or they can't do this makes them want to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's about, it's about priorities. It's about determining who are you, how are you going to respond to this? And what is your response to this going to say about who you are? If I ask you to wear a mask, then you have to weigh your priorities. What are my priorities? Well, my personal priorities as Katie Swartz are, to keep myself safe, to keep my family safe, to keep my community safe, to hopefully contribute in a positive way to the society that I am part of. But not everybody has those priorities. Other people have the priority of, asserting my own personal independence and dominance. How dare you tell me what to do? My core value is I do what I want.
Yeah.
And so that, those decisions tell us who you are, but you can't know sometimes until you're in the moment, in the situation. And so if God is providing opportunities for us to tell ourselves, tell God, tell others who we are, then, is that the same thing as tempting us, trying to get us to go off the path? And then, we're kind of doomed to fail? I don't think it is. Ready to move on?
Yep.
All right. So next we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 through 6. I couldn't fit all of it on here, but I put, I think, the most important elements of it, and I can read the whole thing to you. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger, then by feeding you with manna, with which neither you nor your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The clothes on your back did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Therefore, keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. So again, I think we're looking at answering questions when we're thinking about the story of the Israelites and their temptation in the wilderness or their experience in the wilderness. Who are you? how are you going to respond to the world? How are you going to respond to God? And I don't like, again, some of the way that this is interpreted. Now, this is Deuteronomy. This is not the original story of the wilderness. That's from Exodus. This is an interpretation of that experience. Remember the way that the Lord has done these things. But it says, in order to humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart. Well, yeah, when we use the parent metaphor, I think this is where the parent metaphor starts to break down, because a human parent can't really know who you are in your heart without asking you, without talking to you, without observing you, or sometimes, without testing you. But God already knows what's in our hearts. And so to say that this whole 40-year thing in the wilderness was about testing you to know what was in your heart, I feel like that's really cruel, really overdone, and unnecessary, if that's what it's really about. He humbled you by letting you hunger. So are you suggesting that God tortured the people to test them, to see how they would respond to it? Once again, yikes, not a God that I want to follow. So I'm not a huge fan of that interpretation.
But that's how a lot of people feel,
Yes.
that you have to suffer, and that's how God tests you.
Yes. And that's what I think that's what this question is about. Does God test us? Is the suffering in our lives God trying to, see how strong we are? How much can you bear?
Yeah, I don't believe that.
And I have a pretty big problem with that myself.
I do too.
So in looking at this a little bit, I wanted to know a little bit more about this word testing you. What does that mean? So I looked it up in my handy dandy Hebrew lexicon, and I found this. This is the equivalent of N and H in Hebrew script. And it's really interesting because when you learn about Hebrew, 99% of words have a root, and that root is 3 characters long. This root is only 2 characters long. And so that probably means that this is a really, really old word, very old word that doesn't even follow the appropriate Hebrew grammatical rules. And the root refers to a variety of different verbs. It refers to test and try and tempt and prove, but it also applies to words like attempt or venture. So it doesn't mean try like trial only, it also means try like attempt. And so I find that interesting, that what does it mean that God was testing them to find out what was in their hearts? God already knew what was in their hearts. But if you look at, that kind of thing, 40 years in the wilderness, it's not fun. You're hungry. I don't like the idea that God, would force this kind of thing for the sake of tempting and trying and developing. I don't think that is a good model for a good parent. We could go back to some of our notes from our violence in the Bible class and talk about how this is, seems to be violence coming from God, if we wanted to. But how do we interpret the suffering in our own lives? How do we view the way that we how do we look back on our lives and think about the bad stuff that has happened to us? And I think, in some ways it's a challenge because of our perspective on God. If God created me, if God loves me, if God is all powerful and all knowing, then why would God allow awful things to happen to me? Why would God make awful things happen to me? And this is an interesting and plausible way of answering that question. Well, God is just trying to test you. God is trying to develop you. God is trying to help you to come up with opportunities to answer questions like, who are you and how are you going to live in the world? What kind of person are you going to be? And this is clearly something that people have been thinking about for a really long time, because this word proves to us that even the way that we talk about this has been going on for much longer, even than the very, very ancient Hebrew and its established grammar, because it breaks the rules. So an interesting piece to kind of bring into things, which kind of brings us to the next
Hey,
passage.
Katie, could I say
Yeah.
something?
Sure.
Could you go back to, do you think that, can you take off the Greek symbol there? Okay, that testing part, because like we said, God knows what's in our heart. Could that have meant God wants us to know what was in our heart by testing them? But we have to actually learn what's in our heart. Where are we going to go and what are we going to do?
Yeah, and I think that that's partially legitimate, but at the same time, is that really the only way to know?
Oh yeah, I agree
you
with
know.
you.
And then on the next one, I think I messed up my because I meant for this Greek word to pop up second. So I can read, I can't fix it right now, but I can read the passage to you, because this interpretational concept, we interpret our suffering. So as we're reading the Bible, we, just like the people who wrote the Bible, are trying to understand, why do we suffer? Why is this necessary? So what it says back there that I wanted to show you before I brought up the Greek word is, no testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. So this is one of the most famous Bible passages about this idea that God, yes, does God test you? Yes, of course God tests you. But we can be assured that God will not test us beyond our strength and will provide a way out. Well, that's crap, I think, because anybody who has ever
Amen.
lived has experienced something where, if they believe this passage, will say something like, God, if you really are promising not to test me beyond my strength, then you have way too high an opinion of me, because this is too much. I cannot take this. This is not something that I can endure. How dare
I've
you
said that.
do this to me? And it's harmful. It's harmful to our relationship with God to focus on this passage as the one about the testing. So I wanted to look a little bit deeper into this passage, because this quote, that's very famous, is in context, and it's actually in the context of interpreting those wilderness years that we were just talking about, using that interpretation that we just looked at, so that they assume that those 40 years were a test from God, and that the people who were being tested failed over and over and over again. That's what this passage in 1 Corinthians is saying, that their interpretation of that story is that God kept testing them and they kept failing over and over and over and over. So how is that God not testing you beyond your strength? How is that God providing a way out so that you can endure it? If for 40 years they just kept being tested over and over for the same thing, and they kept failing. But interestingly, this passage is also written not just within the context of the kind of the larger argument that's being made in the text itself, but the audience that's receiving this is experiencing some kind of persecution and suffering, that they are trying to figure out how they're going to live as this new community of Christians within a hostile larger society. And so when Paul is talking to them about this, and now this is where my words was supposed to pop up over top of the text, he's using a word in Greek And the root word for this set of words is para. And this is the same word that we're going to see in all of the other New Testament passages that we're looking at several times, most of the time. Anytime the word test or try is used, this word comes up. And it means trial, attempt, encounter, experience, which I think is interesting. That's kind of in our lexicon, that's kind of more of a neutral word. It's not test or try or attempt, experience, having an experience. But something that's really fascinating to me is that this word comes from an origin word, and this origin word refers to the concept of piercing. And so the word pierce in English comes from this original root, which I think is really interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
So there is a sense here that it's not neutral. It's not just, an experience that you had, but it is a piercing. It is some kind of, negative, forced thing that is there to, do some kind of damage to you, perhaps, or force some kind of change in you. Which I think is very, very fascinating. But I really, like I said before, I really struggle with this passage as the one that people go to when it comes to suffering in their lives. I get that, we're trying to understand, we're trying to figure out what our suffering means. We're trying to figure out, some way to redeem our suffering. But I think that the way that we come down on that, generally speaking, is pretty harmful. And we'll talk about that more as we move through here. Sorry, anything else on that one?
Well, I have never really liked this idea of, that it goes back to the other one, of that God won't give you more than you can endure. Because I don't believe that those things that happen to you come from God. The life and our human condition creates situations that are very painful and hurtful. But when I look at that and I think, yeah, but if you didn't have God, it would be more than you could bear. So these situations will happen to you, but if you have God with you, you can survive it and, maybe be strengthened by it, the adversity or whatever, but that he doesn't create that whole, there I use the word he, but the situation is not created to just make you feel bad or hurt. It is to, it is the fact that you have God with you that you survive those things. I think a lot of people who jump off bridges and do things like that have had more than they can bear. And they didn't know to turn to God for help, or
because maybe they were taught that God was the one causing it.
Yeah.
How can you turn to a parental figure when that parental figure is the one that has created your suffering?
Exactly. Exactly.
Like the kind of, like the situations where a child, tells their parents that they're gay, and their parents say, oh, well, get out of my house. I'm rejecting you. You can't do this. I don't believe in that. And then they go out onto the street, and then they start encountering, tough stuff because they're homeless and they're children. They're not going to go back to their parents and say, hey, can you help me out with this? The parent is the one that caused the problem.
Right.
Why would I go to a God that has caused the suffering for me?
Right.
That's I think that's the problem here. That's the misunderstanding that we just kind of assume is the only way to visualize this. So hopefully I can come up with something else here as we move forward.
Okay.
So let's look at Zechariah chapter 13, verses 8 to 9. And this speaks to the hermeneutic, the biblical hermeneutic, that metaphors help us to explain the unexplainable. It says, in the whole land, says the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire, refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is our God. And so we've got this metaphor. First of all, we've got this metaphor of the refining. What kind of gold are you? And so, some would look at this as, well, I'm going to burn out the impurities. I'm going to make you better. I'm going to run you through all this suffering so that at the other end, everything will turn out okay. But if we bring back again our kind of Olympic trials thing, instead of the temptations and the tests against a particular standard, if the standard is against ourselves, or if the standard is, kind of trying to figure out where we will do best, when we test gold, we're not necessarily looking to purify it, to refine it. We're looking to see, what kind of gold are you? Where, in what capacity will you serve well? If you're not a particularly refined gold, if you're not a particularly pure gold, then, maybe you're best used for some kind of, work in electronics, or, different things like that. If you're more of a pure gold, then you can, you can become a ring. If you are a really, really, really pure gold, then you can be in some of those like microelectronic type of things, like the boards that they put into cell phones and things like that. As I understand it, that has to be super duper refined. And so, maybe that is kind of what's going on here. But I think that, what places like this are trying to do, and we talked about this with the Daniel class and in some other places too, that a lot of this stuff that comes, that speaks about the exilic period for the Jews. So this, Zechariah here, this is talking about, and using the future tense, but talking about what's going to happen to the people when they are conquered, when they are, when their people are decimated. 1/3 shall be left alive, and then they will be put into the fire. They will be tested. They will be refined, and then God will draw them out of the suffering. But most of this stuff, like the Zechariahs, like the Isaiahs, like the Daniels, historical scholars believe was not written before the exilic period. It wasn't even written during the exilic period. It was written after the fact, trying to look back and understand, why did this happen to us? We are God's chosen people. God promised that we would be God's people through Abraham. And so how is it that the promise that God made to Abraham is broken and that we are defeated? How is it that the promise that God made to David is broken and the line of the kings is demolished by these outsiders? How is it that the promise made to Abraham and Moses and the Israelites, that this would be our land, the land flowing with milk and honey, is taken away from us, and we are killed off or removed to live in exile somewhere else? How can a God who loves us and is all powerful let us suffer in this way? And like I said before, if you don't think about it too deeply, the idea that God tests us is a pretty satisfying answer. Well, God does love you, and God could, make the suffering go away. But God is using the suffering. God is causing the suffering, or using the suffering that exists in the world already that God did not cause, to allow you to go through this so that you can grow, so that you can get better, so that you can become the person that God truly wants you to be. But I think we have to, put on the brakes a little bit with that, and kind of take that last step because then, then it gets to the point of, at what point is the suffering too much to be seen as some kind of positive testing from God, positive refining from God? We can talk about basic things, like go back to our example, like the example that I gave with when we were talking about the metaphor of the parent. If your child falls off the curb and scrapes his knee, yeah, I think that's enough. I think that's an appropriate amount of suffering to learn not to walk on the curb. If your child falls off the curb and gets hit by a car and is a paraplegic for the rest of his life, I feel like that's a little bit too far. That's moving into child abuse land. If you say, oh, well, I allowed my child to make that mistake and deal with the consequences of it because that's going to help him. That's going to make him stronger. That's going to make him a better person. What? No parent gets to say that. That parent goes to jail. And so at what point is our suffering too much for us to legitimately continue to interpret, God as a loving parent who is just allowing us to kind of, deal with the world and grow and learn? And I think that there are many examples of that we can look to.
Well, and then suffering can be harder for one person than the other person can go through the same type of suffering, and they can get through it. So suffering can be different levels for different people.
Yeah. And because God knows that about each of us, that makes it all the worse, right? If
Right.
I'm a parent who doesn't completely know what's going on in my child's head and heart, I could maybe be forgiven, not for like throwing them into the middle of traffic, but for allowing particular levels of suffering to happen. And even though, it ends up having more of an impact than I intended, but God doesn't have those limitations. God knows exactly what we can and can't handle. God knows, who has a softer heart in certain areas, and who, has kind of been hardened by other experiences in the world. And so how dare you suggest that, that this suffering is appropriate and okay, and God is causing it or allowing it to happen to me so that it will, fix my life, make me better. But, what's the alternative? It's hard to come up with another potentially satisfying answer to that question. And I think that that's why people tend to cling to this more. So we're going to look at one more passage before we wrap it up for today. And this passage, I think, is kind of in contrast to that 1 Corinthians passage that is the famous one that everybody tends to flock to when we're talking about testing and suffering and how to find hope in that. This is James chapter 1, verses 13 to 16. No one, when tempted, should say, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted, and he himself tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then, when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved. So when it comes to, how we read the Bible, biblical hermeneutics, I think we tend to cherry pick. We tend to go with either what we've been told or what makes most sense to us in the moment, or, sometimes what we would prefer be true. But how do we, balance what we saw in 1 Corinthians with what we see here? You can't tell me that those things are on the face of them compatible. The first one says that God does tempt you, but doesn't tempt you beyond what you can bear. James is saying, how dare you suggest that God tempts someone? God doesn't tempt you. Your own desires tempt you. And then when you give in to those desires, then eventually sin and death enter into your life. And so, obviously these authors had different reasons for writing. They're writing in different contexts. They're trying to make different points to their audience. They have different audiences. They're writing in different time periods. And so it's really important for us when we're reading these things, not to just pull out one little passage that might sound good on the face of it for that particular moment and decide how we're going to interpret it, but to look at the context, to look at where it's coming from, to look at the wider, how does it fit within the wider biblical narrative? The Bible interprets the Bible. So how do we use this passage to interpret other passages? Or how do we use this First Corinthians passage to interpret this passage? And I think at the end of the day, we have to decide, what is God about? What is the overarching message that the Bible gives us about who God is? And when we read some of this stuff, sometimes there isn't a way to argue it away. Sometimes we can't just pull up a bunch of Hebrew words and say, well, yeah, we interpreted it this way, but really it could also mean this. So we can, interpret it this way. Sometimes that doesn't exist. Sometimes it's what it says is what it says. But what do we do when we have these conflicting spaces? Well, it's easier, I think, to go with First Corinthians. Well, I'm so sorry that, your loved one got hit by a car and is in the hospital. But remember that, God is testing you and would never give you more than you can bear. And we'll give you a way out of this and we'll be with you through it all. Well, that's really kind of, nice on the surface, I guess. But if you think about it for 30 seconds,
Not helpful while you're going through it.
did you really just say that God made my person get hit by a car? I mean, seriously. But then, why do people bring that one up instead of this one? God doesn't tempt. God doesn't test us. We are tested and tempted by our own desires. And so maybe in the situation of your loved one being hit by a car, it wasn't God who caused that to happen. That's scary. If God didn't do it, then is God really in control of this world? Where can I go? Where can I turn for comfort? Where can I turn for feeling that things are okay? Where can I turn for safety in this world if these things happen that are not God's desire for the world and for me? Those are harder questions to live with. But I think that's the truth. I think that's where we're called to live, in that uncertain space, and not to allow ourselves to accept seemingly, easier, but also very, very harmful interpretations that eventually are going to cause, serious pain for us because of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So I have an interesting story to share with you about this passage, sort of. Happened in 2017. It was called the Catholic Lord's Prayer controversy. I don't know if you followed any kind of news and seriously at that point, but this was a big deal in December 2017. The French Catholic Church changed their translation of the Lord's Prayer. And in French, it had previously been the equivalent of "lead us not into temptation," which is what we have, but they changed it to "do not let us fall into temptation." And this was a huge scandal. The French Catholics are changing the Lord's Prayer. How dare they? And their decision was based on words that Pope Francis had spoken. He had said, and he's kind of said the same thing again when he was asked about what the French said. He said, "The French have changed the text, and their translation now says, 'Don't let me fall into temptation.' It's me who falls. It's not him who pushes me into temptation as if I fell. A father doesn't do that. A father helps you get up right away. The one who leads into temptation is Satan." And we've talked about my opinions about Satan and what that means, but point being that the Pope, the current Pope, does not think that God tests us, because he would go with this passage. No one should say, "I am being tempted by God." God does not tempt. We fall ourselves.
So why are we still saying it?
I don't know. Maybe we should start a movement to change it in the Lutheran Church.
Because I think that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, the new translation that for a while there they were trying to get going and people rejected it was save us from the time of trial.
Right.
Didn't we use that for a while?
Yeah.
Yes.
It-
Yes.
Yeah. So some churches use that every week. Some, use it sporadically. Others have rejected it completely because they like the original one better because it's more comforting and more familiar to them. But it's harmful, right? Lead me not into temptation. Well, if I have to say that to God, that means that otherwise God would lead me into temptation, right?
Why? I never thought about it. You just automatically say it. You don't always think about everything you're saying.
Mm-hmm. So there's a good one for you to think about this week.
Well,
I'm
that
gonna
really,
keep on saying that.
it really makes a lot of sense in light of our whole discussion.
Yeah. So coming back around to our question, does God test us? I would give that a big fat no. James tells us that God does not tempt us. We just choose to ignore James because people don't like James because it tells us that we have to do stuff. I think James has a lot of interesting stuff to say. Maybe we'll do a James class sometime because nobody ever talks about James. Martin Luther would roll in his grave if we did that. That would be fun. But, does God give us free will? Does God allow us to experience the natural consequences of our actions while also at the same time protecting what is most essential to our being? Yeah, I would say so. The consequences sometimes of our free will is going to be suffering, but we cause that to ourselves. God doesn't cause that to happen to us because God already knows who we are. God doesn't need to test us. Whether there's a standard against which we're being held or whether God just wants us to grow, testing and tempting is not necessary because God already knows our hearts. But I think God does help us to grow. I think that God invites us to do things that we don't think we can do so that we can learn and grow and build confidence and find out who we really are. I think that within the suffering and hurts and sadnesses of this world, God is there with us and God can help us to bring positive results out of those things, even if that's not the original, even if God didn't intend for this thing to happen, God is able to use those situations to bring some kind of positive result from it or some kind of growth or some kind of learning. I would never say that, God would cause someone that I love to get hit by a car, but God is with me. God is there crying and worrying and suffering with me. And God is also there, giving me the strength to help that person with their recovery, to, advocate for better safety measures, to help other people that, with that, so that they don't get hit by cars, all the kinds of things that we can do to bring positive results out of negative circumstances. I think God is there helping us to do those things. But again, is the idea that God tests us a tempting answer? Yes, I think so. The world feels safer and less volatile, I think, if we assume that all the bad stuff is because God is testing us. But it leads so quickly to all these incredibly harmful conclusions. If God tests us, then that means that suffering is God's punishment of evildoers. Like in Haiti, when the big earthquake happened in Haiti. Well, they were evil, they were bad. God is punishing them because they aren't doing what they're supposed to do with their free will. They failed the test. It can lead to the conclusion that God wants or needs this suffering to happen. Well, God wants us to grow, but God needs us to suffer so that can happen. God can do whatever God wants. And the idea that your failure, your suffering is your own fault. You aren't strong enough. If you aren't getting through this quickly enough, it's because you have a problem. You aren't good enough. Well, that's the last thing somebody needs to hear in the middle of their suffering, right? Well, God would never, test you beyond what you can bear. And so if you feel like you can't bear this, then there's something wrong with you. You need to work on you. No, I don't. I'm suffering. I'm struggling. I'm hurting. How dare you bring that as your message? Tell me that God loves me. Tell me that you are here for me to help me get through this in whatever way you need me to be. Tell me that you will be the hands and voice and feet of God in the world for me right now. Don't tell me that God is testing me and I'm failing it because I'm not strong enough. What are you, crazy? I think those are the limitations of this question. And I think that's why I have no choice but to come back around to no as the answer to this question. So one more Bible passage, and I think this is kind of our last biblical hermeneutics idea. Context matters. This verse, Romans 8:28, we know all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. I think this is one of the most damaging passages that we have in the Bible, or is used in very damaging ways, because it's interpreted to mean that this suffering is for your good. All things work together for good, even this suffering that you're going through, even this horrible circumstance, even the fact that your entire family just got killed in a fire, or even though your country just fell off the earth and went into the ocean. Well, all things work together for good. So this suffering is for your good. And even worse, perhaps, the conclusion is, well, you don't love God, or you don't love God enough. And that's why things aren't good, because things work together for good for those who love God. And so if you don't love God properly, then things will go bad for you. So if things are going bad for you, then you must not be loving God hard enough. You must not be doing a good enough job. But no, that is an incorrect interpretation of this verse, because you don't keep reading. You don't look at the rest of it. I think that the hardest thing in rejecting this idea that God tests us is that we have to sit with the idea that suffering is a mystery, and that we have to live with that uncertainty. Why do people suffer if God loves us and God could take it all away? Why not? Why doesn't God do it? When is it too much for it to be about growth or about free will? But what we do know is where it all ends. And we can hold on to that promise, I think. So I want to read to you this whole passage in context, because I think it helps us to interpret what this verse really means. It says, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn within a large family. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. What then are we to say about these things that we're just read about? If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not withhold his own Son, but gave him up for us all, will he not with him also give us everything else? Who will bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? It is Christ Jesus who died, yes, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed intercedes for us. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. So when we look at this verse by itself, if God is for us, who is against us? Not even ourselves. We can't condemn others as not loving God enough, because who is to condemn? Only God, but God does not condemn us. Do not suggest that God is punishing or testing or tempting, because nothing can separate us from the love of God. Even our own choices or our own interpretation of God's behavior or personality. If we think that God is tempting us or testing us, we're trying to separate ourselves from God's love. But nothing can separate us from God's love. So when we look at it in context, it's impossible to come to those conclusions that suffering is good for us, that it's our fault that we're suffering, that God is tempting us, that God is testing us. It's about what's important, what's central. And if we keep that in mind, then all the harmful things that people try to tell us and all the harmful interpretations of the Bible can fall away. So that's what I have for today. Thoughts, questions, disagreements?
Wow. It's always so much to think about. Because that question of why doesn't God just take all the evil out of the world? If, why are things so messed up? If, why doesn't God just fix everything? I don't know. I mean, it's not because he can't, because I guess he could. There's that he again. But I don't know. It's really confusing to me.
And I think that a lot of these harmful positions, come down to trying to come up with a satisfying answer to that. Because, you can go so far with a variety of these things. Well, if God was going to intervene and stop all the suffering, then that means that there could be no free will, because God would have to stop us from being able to make choices. If we make the wrong choice, there's always some level of suffering. And so if God stopped us all from making the wrong choice, then there wouldn't be any suffering anymore, but then free will would be gone. And God wants us to be able to, have free will, to be other than God. But then, you always come up against some kind of limitation on that. Okay, well, I get that, I make a bad choice and I stub my toe, but I don't get that some guy makes a bad choice and 4 million Jews die. There are levels here. And I think same thing with any of the other possibilities. Well, God is leading me through this tough time so that I can grow and learn. Maybe some stuff, maybe when you're really struggling with math, God is helping you to learn to value, hard work and perseverance. But, when someone you love gets some kind of terminal disease or something, I don't think that you can say that. I think that there are always going to be places where you hit a wall with this, and you either start going into places that are theologically inappropriate, or you just have to say, beyond this place, it's a mystery and I don't understand, I don't know, and I've got to, put my faith in God and trust in God, because God is faithful. God is not the gotcha moment parent. God is always there to lift us up and support us, not cause us to fall and stumble. Any other final thoughts?
Too much to think about.
All right. Well, next week, hold on to your hats. We're going to talk about the question, what is Christian nationalism? So that'll be fun.
So you're going to start off with what does that mean, huh?
Yes. Yes, we will.
Okay, good.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank you.
lovely rest of your day. Enjoy this nice weather.
Oh, it's beautiful out there.
Yep. Well, see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.